Tilly Wedekind outlived her husband Frank by 50 years. She didn't remarry. When she died, she was buried on top of Frank in his grave plot. She truly loved him, deeply and madly. In fact, she suffered several nervous breakdowns after he had died, and it was only many years later that her young psychiatrist suggested that she write her story, which became LULU, the role of my life. And this was part of a movement that was happening in Germany in the 1970s, which was called Verständigungsliteratur. And Verständigung means to communicate, to understand. And this movement was all about people finding ways of writing their narratives to try and make sense of their feelings, their fantasies, their difficulties, their despairs. And as a result, they were able to give word and shape to the confusing feelings. By the end of her autobiography, Tilly has a much clearer idea of who she is. And she was nearly 80 when she wrote it. I think you're never too old to tell your story, to find your own voice, to shape your own narrative. To which end, I turned 60 recently, and it's only in revisiting all this material for Tilly Nobody that I've really begun to realize the bond between actor and character. What I've actually discovered, which has been a surprise in so many ways, is that in creating these micro-documentaries, as well as getting ready to perform Tilly Nobody, it's been my Verständigungsliteratur. For much of my life, I'd been pretty ashamed of what I'd experienced in my 20s, of what I'd enabled, of the violence that had been manifested inside myself. And I'd actually buried so much of it so deeply that I'd actually forgotten about most of it. I'd forgotten about the LULU diary. I had forgotten many details until actually I was in that staged violence class at Shakespeare & Company, and I felt my body telling me there was still a narrative embedded in my musculature. But by creating Tilly Nobody and uncovering that actor-character bond, I feel as if I'm kind of walking the talk of what it is that I think Tilly was doing. I felt kind of protective of both Frank Wedekind and the person I've renamed Henry while I've been making these micro-documentaries. They were both incredibly creative and very talented and funny. And they were both very loving and very tender people. But the tricky thing was they both suffered persecution, mania, which I think could be another way of saying they didn't really know how to love themselves. Frank and Henry wrote characters who cheated on their husbands. And as playwrights, they lived in abject fear that their real-life partners were going to do the same thing. Somewhere along the line, love had become something of a catastrophe. It's not uncommon for the survivors of domestic violence to feel very protective towards their abusers, because ultimately we love them and we want to support them through the pain they're experiencing. It's just that, like Tilly, I simply didn't have the tools to deal with it at that time. I didn't know how to say the right thing. In fact, Rachel Snyder says that if she had to whittle down the way to change domestic violence to just one idea that might make a difference, it would be communication. And I would like to say that Tilly Nobody is my love letter to communication. When we shared the play at the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, as I mentioned in a previous episode, we discovered that when we dared to share our own story, other people then felt emboldened, empowered to share their stories. There was a space, there was a permission, there was a structure, there was vocabulary to so do. So in my small way, Tilly Nobody is my contribution towards loving communication in the face of the catastrophes of human pain. The final line of Tilly Wedekind's autobiography, LULU, the role of my life, which she finished just before her 80th birthday, she writes, "I had the burning desire to act in the theatre again." We hope to see you there soon.